Hi guys, my name is Lara Setrakian. It's a joy to be with you to tell you this story about how I built Syria deeply. It's something I built with love, with all my heart and all my entrepreneurial energy and with all the guts that it takes to bet on your own idea. And I did it because I felt like the news is broken. Essentially, we're just not getting the same kind of information we used to get. We're not getting in-depth on complex issues, especially when it comes to global issues that are affecting life around the world. So that's what moved me and a team of what was a volunteer army to put ourselves to work trying to fix it. So here is where I was at the start of the story. I was reporting for ABC News and Bloomberg Television, covering the Middle East. It was a fantastic job, kind of my dream gig, and it started when I was 25. ABC News sent me to be a digital reporter in the Islamic Republic of Iran with a backpack and a camera and an order to bring back stories for an American audience. And my career really rose alongside the rise of Twitter. So I found myself enmeshed in this global conversation where everyone I could hear, from Morocco to Minnesota, wanted to talk about the same things. They wanted to understand what was happening in the Middle East. They wanted to understand a part of the world that was half a world away. And they really wanted to wrap their heads around what was a gradual evolution in the Middle East that turned into an overnight revolution in the same part of the world. So in December 2011, what we call the Arab Spring took root. This is a Twitter timeline of the hashtags that unfolded online as the protests were unfolding on the streets. And this was really a conveyance of how these activists were using social media to both organize and publicize their protests. So here's how we saw it unfold. It started in Tunisia, in the town of Sidi Bouzid, where a young man set himself on fire and ultimately gave his life to protest what it was like to live in a brutal dictatorship. That sparked the uprising on January 25th in Egypt, what came to be known as the Tahrir Square uprising. That sparked the Bahrain uprising in February 14th in what was called Lulu or Pearl Square, February 17th in Libya, February 20th in Yemen, and ultimately Syria. Syria was the last one in the sequence, and partially because of that, it got the least attention. The media spotlight had moved on. We had somehow stopped paying attention to that part of the world. Or at the very most, we were paying attention to the fight against Muammar Gaddafi. And that's the moment that really changed my life. Because I know Syria, I know the people in Syria. And I know that that story was the biggest example I had seen of an issue that was so highly consequential and just hardly comprehensible. People could not wrap their heads around how complex that story was. And in my profession, we weren't doing nearly enough to help you understand what was happening. And that's essentially what changed my life. Out of love for the people in Syria and love for anyone in the world who wanted to understand them, I wanted to come up with a better way to wrap your head around what was happening in that country when no one was really talking about it. So ultimately, what I saw was that there was a market failure in foreign news. The news was essentially failing to deliver enough insight for people to get the context and the history and the background of what was happening. And it was really a very simple formula that basically spoke to a breakdown in the supply chain of foreign news. We've seen bureaus shuttered because they cost too much to operate. We've seen foreign correspondents cut for the same reason, the commercial pressures in maintaining their full-time operations. And that's led to basically gutting the volume of international stories in the US press. By 2010, we were down by more than half. So seeing that that was the case, the result was that we basically did not have an enriched knowledge pool when it came to global issues. There was mass confusion. People could hardly understand any one of these global issues that I would cover on a regular basis. And when it came to Syria, I just felt that that was a tragedy that I was in a position to help. So basically, by the time we got to the US debate over whether to strike Syria, 45% of Americans felt they didn't have enough information to have an opinion in a country where we have a very low bar for having an opinion. So, I mean, I could just feel that that was how thin the knowledge pool had become. So I took a time out from television and built Syria deeply. And I had a team of incredible people and partners from Prezi to Google to SoundCloud and Ushahidi, helping us build a single subject news website that would go in deep on the Syria crisis, that would include who's who, how we got here, background, news. A lot of it was curated crowdsourcing, or handpicking what I felt was relevant for you to understand about Assad and his regime and why it's lasted so long. So we had everything from news updates to original reporting from Syrian and Arab journalists to our own reporting and original interviews to data maps, background, podcasts, Google Hangouts with subject matter experts. And that was really important to me as a TV person, because I would usually interview someone and give you a 20-second clip when at least some of you wanted to hear the full 30-minute interview. So putting that up for the world to see and letting them absorb just as much as they had time for was really, really important to me. So we built Syria deeply, and I really kind of didn't know what to expect. I was leaving behind something that everyone in media tends to value, which is time in the spotlight, time on camera, to basically build a website. Nobody understood why. My family thought I was nuts, because I'd earned my place on this rising TV totem pole. But it meant less to me than giving this a try and creating something that I believe in. So what ended up happening is we actually hacked the news cycle. People who were at the intersection of old and new media could see exactly what we were doing. We were building a scalable model to take on foreign news, especially when it comes to crisis zones that really don't get all that much attention. We had folks in old media calling us innovators. That was really nice. And by and large, and I feel really uncomfortable showing you pictures of my face, but generally, because it's not about me, it's about what we created. But the fact that we would get wheeled out in times of crisis to share what we know and enrich the national conversation is what it was really all about. That was our end goal. We also had a chance to tell our industry what we were learning from the digital front lines. And that was also important to me, because we really don't have that much room to innovate from within news organizations. We have to step outside. We have to create new models. And what we were doing was basically building an open source R&D lab as practitioners, as journalists who wanted to take on the story a different way. And why that really counts in terms of my original mission is that our reporting kept getting picked up. People said really nice things about us. And that usually doesn't really matter to me, but the fact that people thought we were crazy when we started, but once we launched, they could see what we were trying to do, meant that it was more than certain that we did the right thing. We stepped out of line, we did things a different way, and people could see the value. And also importantly, our reporting got picked up, which is what we really wanted. We wanted our coverage to become part of the news cycle, to become part of the conversation. And that's what really drove us to keep going. And then at the time of the crisis, we spoke to some cool world leaders. We did a Google Hangout with Secretary of State John Kerry right before he went to Geneva to negotiate with the Russians. And for that conversation, I pulled in Nick Kristof at the New York Times and one of our favorite collaborators, a social studies teacher from Buffalo, New York, who uses Syria deeply in the classroom. He read out questions from teachers across the United States for Secretary Kerry, who gave us 38 precious minutes of his time. We're really, really glad that we could do a hard-hitting interview with that sort of an approach. So from there on, we got approached by people who wanted their issue redesigned, who wanted a different kind of news for whatever they cared about. So now we're talking to potential partners and folks who feel passionately about taking on complex global issues, from ones with a geographic focus like Egypt deeply, Pakistan deeply, and Myanmar deeply. My personal passion is for conflict zones and states in transition. I think they need special attention. We can't really just turn away and check in when they explode. Also geostrategic issues like poverty deeply, food deeply, and then science, technology, and public health issues. People asking us to do oceans deeply, brain deeply. We just had a conversation about robotics deeply. And I plot all of these, because I'm a huge nerd, on a 2x2 matrix of what has a high need for information and a high opportunity for impact. And when that happens, and you see that there's an identifiable underserved audience on an issue, we feel like we need to make it happen. So for Each Deeply, we're creating a Teach Deeply. That teacher in Buffalo helped us create an open lesson plan using our content on Syria, so that social studies teachers who often want to teach about global issues but don't feel like they always have all the information or they can do it on their own, have the efficiency of working with journalists to create that content and put it out there to the world. And that's been a huge success in the classroom. There is a thirst to understand what's happening in the world. And for me, who watches the world and goes back and forth between here and foreign countries, I can see that our failure to understand what's happening in the world has become an American liability. It's already hurting us in this generation, and it's going to shape outcomes for the coming generations unless we find a quantum leap to change how we approach understanding the world around us and our place in it. So that, all of it, helps me keep my commitment to the Syria story, helps me focus on the end user. What's your takeaway from my news report? What is your user experience of how I've captured a story? Because at the end of the day, journalism is advanced sense-making. How am I helping you make sense of what I see in the world? And that's where I really care to put my time and my energy in the years to come. Thank you. Now, I didn't want to leave without giving you some of what we've learned from the Syrian crisis. This incredible image is from Syria, from an artist that we've covered who took a bombed-out wall and recreated Gustav Klimt's The Kiss on that bombed-out wall. It's just breathtaking. And we also have with us Jinan Musa, who is joining us via Skype. She's one of our great collaborators. What we learned over the course of this exercise, hi Jinan, good to see you.
Hi, Lara.
Before we jump in, I want to just share this lesson that we've learned, which is that the future of news is about collaboration. No one person has the answer, but collectively we can approach the truth. So we've interacted with and coached Syrian journalists and then worked with professionals like Jinan, who goes in and out of the country for incredibly courageous reporting to help us understand what's going on at any given moment with consistency. So Jinan is going to share what she thinks are the 3 things you need to know about the Syria conflict today, based on her reporting for Al-An TV. So Jinan, what's the first thing that you want this room to know about what's happening in Syria?
The first thing actually that comes to mind is the amount of desperation that I see on the ground when I'm inside Syria. What strikes me always is that ordinary people, just like you and I, they are totally desperate. There is hunger. Many people do not have enough to eat. The problem is not the lack of food, because as you know, Lara, in northern Syria, it's an agricultural society, so there is food, but people do not have money anymore to buy stuff. They've lost their jobs, they do not have a salary. Last time I was inside, a father walked up to me and said that he is willing to sell his kidney for some money, and he was asking me whether I would know anybody who would buy it. Seriously, I'm sometimes just incapable of understanding how no one is doing anything to end this human tragedy. I simply cannot forget, for example, one mom who was swearing to me that she does not have milk, she does not have diapers for her newborn baby. I cannot forget 10-year-old Ali and his 4 sisters. They are all handicapped and they do not have money to buy 5 wheelchairs. On top of that, Lara, on top of the hunger, the striking amount of dead and injured. Every time I go into Syria, I see dead people in front of me. A total of 130,000 human beings have died so far in this conflict. Add to that the amount of wounded. Last time I was in a hospital which is filled with women and children who lost their limbs during the war. They have no arms, they have no legs, they have no prospects, no future. Most of the people I speak to, honestly, they're just so sick and tired of it all. They just want to see a ceasefire as soon as possible.
And what's the second thing you want us all to know about Syria today?
Actually, it's the Islamist fact. There was an Islamic element to the Syrian revolution since the beginning, but the last half year, I've noticed a steady and worrisome rise of Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups in rebel territory. During the first 2 years of the conflict, most of the rebels that I saw on the ground were Syrians, but now more and more rebels that I see are non-Syrian jihadists from the Gulf, from North Africa, from the United Kingdom, continental Europe, and even some Americans. Their violence against moderate rebel groups have weakened, almost destroyed the opposition, and their violence against the population of northern Syria has made them so much feared by the people, as much as they fear the Assad regime. To give you an example, I met a man whose elder brother was kidnapped for 1.5 years by the Assad regime. He was released 3 months ago, but then his younger brother was kidnapped by the ISIS, and this is
Al-Qaeda.
The most powerful Al-Qaeda group in northern Syria. Luckily, the younger brother is released now, but they've decided all to move to Turkey, because he told me this is not the revolution that we've started, and this man is not alone. I know tens of Syrian activists who are facing exactly the same dilemma. The worrying thing about these jihadists, Lara, is that they brought with them their wives. Some of them have their wives, some of them have their children with them. They come from countries like Bangladesh, Uzbekistan, etc., etc. Some of them are marrying local Syrian women. Their message is clear, they are there to stay. And thus they are changing the fabric of the Syrian society.
And what's
In addition to that, they apply a very strict interpretation of Sharia law. They behead their opponents, they destroy churches, they force women to cover up, and the most scary part is that they are starting their own schools. So Syrians who are known among Muslims to be moderates, unfortunately these jihadists seem to be on a mission to destroy that.
So the longer this goes on, the more the Islamist element becomes threatening to the way of life Syrians have always known. What's the third and final thing you want everyone here to know about Syria?
The tragedy of the Syrian refugees. I mean, you all know that there are now 6 million people in Syria who have lost their homes. 2 of them are refugees outside their countries, and 4 of them, they're internally displaced. I want to give you an example. One woman that I met recently, her name is Dia. She's 30 years old, and she's an internally displaced woman from the city of Hama. She had 2 children. Imagine, they both died in their tent in the refugee camp because their tent caught fire, so they burned to death. She mostly spends her time nowadays just staring at their pictures and crying. She told me last month that she wants to get pregnant, but it's not working. She needs treatment, and just like so many Syrians, she has no money to treat herself. To me, this woman is like a metaphor to the crisis, to the Syrian crisis. She's homeless, she's desperate, and her life, day after day, is only going from bad to worse.
Jinan Moussa Villan TV, thank you so much for sharing a glimpse of what you've learned covering the Syria crisis. And that's the end of our talk. I hope you check out Syria deeply, and come see me if you want to think about and work on the future of news. Thank you.